Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our current series of Planning Live webinars. My name is Victoria Elaine, and I am a Senior Associate in the Brodie's planning team. As you all know, the reforms to the planning system changed the development plan system, getting rid of strategic development plans so that the development plan now comprises the National Planning Framework and the Local Development Plan. The reforms also changed the way that local development plans are prepared, introducing a duty on planning authorities to prepare an evidence report, which is to inform the plan-making process and to provide a baseline from which planning authorities can assess where development should take place in their areas. The evidence report needs to go through a gate check process by an independent reporter and be found to be sufficient before the planning authority can proceed to prepare its proposed plan. Now, those of you keeping an eye on the gate checks which have taken place to date will be aware that it was a 50-50 split so far, with 4 reports being deemed sufficient and 4 being sent back to the planning authorities as insufficient. However, that very recently moved to 5-3 following a resubmission that reached the sufficiency stage. So that's the standings that we have at the moment, although obviously there are other evidence reports in process, but those are the numbers that have been determined so far. Now, to provide some insight into the gate check process and what reporters are looking for, I am delighted to welcome Assistant Chief Reporter Allison Coard and Stephen Hall, who is also a reporter at DP, both of whom have been dealing with some of the gate checks to date. Firstly, Allison has been a reporter for 18 years. Whilst reporters do not specialise, Allison has been the lead reporter for numerous development plan examinations and carried out the first of the current round of gate checks. Prior to becoming a reporter, Allison worked in development planning at Stirling Council and for Edinburgh City Council. Stephen has been a reporter since 2013 and has been the lead reporter on the examination of 7 development plans. Prior to joining DP, Stephen worked in the Planning and Architecture Division of the Scottish Government and was involved in the housing policy and the implementation of the development planning provisions of the 2006 Planning Act. And last but by no means least, asking the questions today is Elaine Farquharson-Black, who most of you will already know and is one of our planning partners and head of our house building team here at Brodie's. As I say, delighted to be joined by you all this afternoon. So over to you, Elaine. Thanks.
Thanks, Victoria, and thank you, Alison and Stephen, for joining us this afternoon. We'll jump straight in. I think in terms of, Victoria said that we're now at 5-3, 5 being sufficient and 3 being insufficient. So I thought, Alison, that we might start by exploring at what is meant by sufficiency, what is sufficient and what is insufficient.
Yes, thank you. And just to say thanks for inviting us along today to tell you a bit about the gate check process. In terms, I mean, obviously the sufficient and insufficient is sort of key to the role that we play here, and it's a slightly novel role for a reporter in that we are being the gate checkers and the assessors rather than sort of weighing and balancing evidence led by others, which is our more normal role. The starting point clearly is the legislative provision, so we look to that first of all in terms of what it requires in terms of helping us to assess what is sufficient. Although it sets matters out in quite broad terms, if you've looked at the legislation, you'll see it's quite a bit of content, but it's fairly broad in its terms. It also the legislation establishes the need for the planning authority to seek the views of others. And that's quite important so that it's the initial stages of the development plan. We've also the legislative provision which talks about the planning authority's view of the evidence. That's something that we've given some weight to because it points to the fact that it's not just about the evidence per se, but it is about the interpretation of the evidence. the distillation of that evidence and an understanding of what it means for the plan. So that seems quite important, and something I think people have maybe found a little bit more difficult to get to grips with. In terms of the sufficiency, insufficiency, the process is quite regulation light. So beyond the legislative provision, we've had to rely, we do rely on the Scottish Government guidance on development plans, which sets out in detail the Scottish Government's expectations of what the gate check process and what the evidence report are designed to achieve. And we also place weight on the policy context that's set by National Planning Framework 4. So all those different provisions really weigh into our objective assessment of sufficiency or insufficiency. We're conscious that the test of sufficiency equates to one of good enough, if you like. So, it's not that we're looking for absolutely everything to be covered, but we're looking for it to be sufficient to proceed to the next stage of the development plan process. So yeah, I hope that sort of answers the question.
Yeah,
but if you've got anything you want to know,
that's helpful. It's, as you say, it's about making sure there's sufficient evidence to proceed to the next stage rather than looking at the detail. It's, is the evidence there to support the LDP? So it's kind of, we're more used to the LDP examination process. As you say, this is a different process. Stephen, the Act sets out what an evidence report needs to include, but there's no statutory format, and we do have the guidance that suggested a template. The ministers did suggest you might want to use this template. Have the evidence reports that have come in, have they followed that template? Have you seen differences in approaches?
Hi, Elaine, and thanks also for having me along today. I think it's fair to say there have been quite a variety of different approaches and formats followed by the evidence reports we've seen so far. Some authorities have adopted the template from, I think it's figure 7 of the local development planning guidance, pretty wholesale. Others have captured all the different information requirements that are included in the template, but not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily follow a template format as you look at it on the page. Other authorities have taken more of a place-based approach. So I suppose I should explain that the template is more of a topic-based approach, looking at perhaps linking to the different policies in NPF4. But the guidance does hint that authorities may wish to follow a place-based approach as an alternative to that. Or other authorities have taken more of an abbreviated format and not used the template per se, but perhaps have had a more summary approach, and then separately submitted a range of background templates or documents to cover the information in more detail in background documents. And I think those two latter approaches maybe have been followed and potentially been quite effective as a way of encouraging public engagement and involvement in the process, and to encourage people to respond to consultation exercises. But from our point of view, it's sometimes that approach has made it a bit more difficult to be 100% clear as to just what material does form part of the evidence report itself and what material is background material. So I suppose while there's no required format, our focus has to be on the sufficiency of the reporting of the evidence. And it's fair to say that certainly from our point of view, it's tended to be more straightforward to assess those reports where the information has been brought together in the suggested template. But that if other formats are used, it's important to make sure that the matters that the template covers are responded to in the evidence report. And that includes district-wide information as well as place-based, local area-based information, and also responses from key consultees, key agencies, some analysis of the success or otherwise of the existing development plan, and some analysis of what the evidence means for the new plan going forward. And those are all things that also have to be adequately and logically addressed.
That's some good inside information there for planning authorities preparing their evidence reports. Now, you mentioned obviously consultation and engagement. Now, planning authorities don't need to consult, they don't need on their evidence reports, but they do need to set up what engagement they've been with stakeholders, as you mentioned, in the preparation of the report. Are you looking at the sufficiency of the consultation which has taken place?
I wouldn't say that we're looking at the sufficiency of it. No, that doesn't come in with it. That doesn't come within our overall remit of the sufficiency of the evidence report. But certainly the responses that are made to any consultation or engagement process are very relevant to us. Because those stakeholder comments will inform our view as to the sufficiency of the evidence. So stakeholders, for instance, they may highlight gaps, or they may highlight areas of dispute, and we want to look at those. So we would expect the authority to supply us with records of the consultation and engagement that they've done, and that will have a role for us in supporting and validating the evidence. And the evidence itself we could determine that if it would fall short, if it didn't include some views from key consultees, and I'm thinking particularly of some key bits of evidence, like, for instance, I think we'd always want to know that SEPA was, or at least what SEPA's view was on the authority's approach to strategic flood risk assessment, for instance, or Transport Scotland's views on the authority's approach to transport assessment. So, yeah, consultation is important, even if we're not, and seeing what the consultation responses are is important, even if we're not directly assessing the approach that was taken.
Yeah, thank you. So, Alison, if I can come back to you, the process to be followed at the gate check is at the discretion of the reporter. So how does the reporter decide what process to follow? And has the process been the same for the assessments that have been carried out so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the guidance, I talked about how much we rely on the guidance, and the guidance is clear about a proportionate approach. And the gate check process was never meant to be a delaying factor in the development plan process. That said, there's unlikely to be a one-size-fits-all approach, and the process is governed by the specifics of the evidence report and the issues of a particular case. Today, in the ones that we've done, that it's been very process light, and when we've had some sort of feedback from planning authorities who said, well, why didn't you ask us? We could have explained that, but we have basically looked at trying to think about what is a proportionate approach, how can we influence the outcome, and there really have been very few written requests to date. They've been looking for minor clarification and submission of some reference correspondence. Further information requests have been really the exception rather than the norm. We've relied on our recommendations for improvement. So we've identified insufficiency and just basically set that out on the basis that there's no other way to address that without sending it back. And we might talk about that a bit later. But the approach to date very much reflects the fact that the reporter has no power here to change the report without sending it back. So the only remedy to an issue is actually to send it back. So if we can be clear enough about what we think's wrong with it, it seems the best use of everyone's time is to send it back to be fixed.
Yeah, no, and I was going to, I think you kind of covered one of the questions that I was going to put to you there, was in terms of, the reporter's got the power to ask for additional information, and whether if that power had been used, would that have addressed the insufficiencies, the ones that have been returned as insufficient? But I think what you're saying is, no, you've taken the view that it's insufficient, and you've got no power to change, so you put it back to the planning authority.
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely recognise that the planning authority may have been able to provide further explanation or background evidence. However, the reporter's remit is to check whether the evidence report itself provides a clear and transparent basis to proceed to produce the development plan. And, if the reporter's understanding of a substantive matter relies on us delving into further submissions and correspondence, or having to further interrogate the planning authority's thinking, then that in itself likely points to an insufficiency, because it should be clear on the face of the report how these issues are addressed.
Yeah.
And clear reasoning, as long as we can provide clear reasoning for the return of the report, then that should enable the planning authority to take the necessary steps to rectify the matter, and hopefully do that in a timely manner. I was trying to think of any instances where we might ask for further process, and to date we've not really encountered a circumstance where we would do that, but that doesn't mean to say that would never be the case. You could perhaps envisage a case where, say, we had sent it back on a particular matter and then it came back again and it hadn't been properly addressed. That might indicate some, even a hearing to try to really, resolve the matter and make sure that at the next iteration, we were definitely looking at something that was fit for purpose. But certainly we've not encountered that situation yet.
Okay, and you mentioned, obviously, we talked about sufficiency, and there's no minimum standard of evidence. It's back to that, but Stephen touched on they've come in different formats, and there's no minimum standard. So how does the planning authority know that it's sufficient, and how does the reporter know it's sufficient? Is it subjectively? What are you looking for that says, yep, sufficient?
Yeah, it really, I suppose, goes back to what we talked about in the first question. That we do rely on the Act, the guidance, and NPF4 when read together. Where there are recognised gaps, we hope that these could be acknowledged, and we talked about it being, good enough. So, there will be imperfections, there will be things that are, where they've perhaps not been able to engage sufficiently with a certain stakeholder or agency, but they recognise that as a gap, and it's something that can be clearly set out as an intention before they prepare the proposed plan. That in itself may be sufficient. So it's being clear about those next steps and being upfront and open about the fact that there could be information that's not quite perfect at this stage. We've placed importance on the fact that evidence report should reflect a very evidence-based approach to plan preparation. So record keeping and the use of hyperlinks, that's something that we've really encouraged in the outreach work we've done with planning authorities prior to submitting the evidence report, because I think there's clear benefits in the evidence report being a consolidated reference document that people can rely on going forward, particularly looking forward to any subsequent development plan examination, where it will be a very important evidence source, and it will assist the authority in responding, and hopefully it will be a very good resource in assisting the authority in responding to matters raised in representation at the examination stage.
I know that's interesting. You obviously said there that they don't need to necessarily have everything at the time, but a kind of route to say, well, it is our intention to get this, and then you're happy that will provide the kind of evidence. So that's interesting. It's not a case of it's all got to be there or nothing. There's an element of flexibility in the terms of, we know you haven't got that yet, but that's fine. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it's about that having that firm basis to proceed. And so as long as we can be reassured that the direction of travel is in place to make sure that we've not got flaws or gaps in evidence once we get to the proposed plan, I guess that, that would be sufficient.
Yeah. Stephen, you mentioned obviously, that you've seen the kind of policy-based reports and the place-based reports. Are you able, without mentioning any names, are you able to say any things that have been really good in terms of the evidence reports that have come in, things that have been done very well?
Yeah, I think our letters are on record now, so I can potentially say positive things about individual councils' work. I think generally, across the board, we've been pretty impressed with the sheer volume of evidence that authorities have managed to capture in their reports. When you see the amount of background reports and research and analysis that authorities have either done themselves or have got access to, all brought together in one place in the evidence report, it's really very impressive, I think, in all cases. And generally, I think a comprehensive picture has emerged of what those places are like, how they function in spatial terms, and that's been genuinely fascinating to learn about and to read about. But I think what the most successful evidence reports have done is about how they present that information in the most logical and consistent and accessible manner for us. So, whether or not authorities have used the template, I think that the reports that have passed through the gate check successfully are the ones that have tended to be the ones that have taken the topic-based approach, but not to say that need necessarily be the case. And that's a policy-based approach that's linked directly usually to the policies of NPF4, or grouping the policies of NPF4 into convenient groupings. And then they've not only summarised and linked to the relevant evidence, but they've continued the thought process on by explaining their consultation process and how people have the comments people have made on that evidence and what the council's response is to that, what the implications of that evidence are for the proposed plan. And also we've talked about the evidence gaps. The ones I think some of the ones I've dealt with have been very upfront and clear where there are gaps in the evidence. That's not necessarily a problem as long as the authorities setting out how they're looking to address those gaps and or explaining why the gap is inevitable and perhaps can't be filled. I suppose the last point I'd make is about that balance between throwing the kitchen sink into the evidence report itself, or summarising that evidence within the evidence report, and then hyperlinking and signposting where the evidence can be found in background documents. And we want the evidence report itself to be an accessible summary, but also to be detailed enough for people to get the proper view of what's going on. So yeah, I'd say of the ones that we've seen so far, Falkirk is quite a good example of one that is relatively concise as an evidence report, but still manages to point to where the evidence can be found and summarises it at a successful level.
Stephen, sorry, just before Elaine continues the discussion, I wonder if I might jump in with a question that has been asked, and that is picking up on the discussion there about the influence of NPF4. Obviously, the planning community generally has been keeping a close watch as particularly some of the headline policies under NPF4, Policy 1 on climate and nature crises, Policy 2 on climate mitigation and adaptation and biodiversity, etc., as those policies have been interpreted through court and appeal decisions. Are you seeing a particular influence also in that respect through the gate check process, perhaps in comparison to pre-NPF4 LDPs?
Yeah, I'd probably need to think about that. I think of the ones I've seen, yes, the biodiversity gain, for instance, is certainly something that's coming through strongly on some of the ones that I've seen. I mean, I think the climate issues, climate change issues have been obviously in the planning atmosphere for some time, you know, so I don't know if I'd say that there's been a particular increase in the emphasis placed on them at this stage, but still, you know, definitely up front and, you know, where you'd expect to see them. I don't know, Alison, you probably have more of an overview of the range of the evidence reports. Have you picked up on anything about that?
I think as a topic, it's very much more at the forefront. Varying levels, I think, you know, there have been good examples and maybe not such good examples, but I think it is an important issue and very much one that we'd wish to see reflected in the evidence that's coming forward. And it's certainly one of the things that we picked up in terms of the things we're looking for in our assessment, is that that's been ticked off.
Great, thanks.
Thank
you.
Alison, obviously, Stephen gave a shout out to Falkirk. Well done, Falkirk, there. I'm going to come to you to ask you about the things that maybe not been done so well, and so you don't need to name any names for them either. But you know, has there been particular areas where most of the ones that have fallen down in particular areas?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because in some of the feedback we've had recently was that well, your reports are a bit negative, and I suppose that's a reflection of the fact that we're setting out the reasons for return. So it doesn't mean that there's not been good things in those reports as well, and quite a lot of the good things that Stephen reflected on have been evident in the ones that have been returned. You know, it's just that the reasons for return are very much focusing on where we have found it insufficient. So I thought it was worth just explaining that. I suppose what's not been done so well is, you know, housing is always a hot topic. It's an important issue. It's important in terms of the legislative provision. It's important in terms of MPF4. We have the MATLR that's established by MPF4. And there is evidence on which that is based. It is an evidence-based approach. So I suppose it started the foundation for the evidence that would feed into the housing land requirement. So authorities or evidence reports we've seen so far have not always been as good as we might have expected at explaining updated or new evidence in addition to the MATLR, you know, that has informed their position on the housing land requirements specific to their authority. We've also sometimes lacked a clear explanation of what the housing land requirement, the local housing land requirement, means for the plan, and the sort of connection between that and the other evidence areas, because there's clear implications for infrastructure, there's environmental linkages, there's things like flooding. So it's making the connections, because your evidence report might have a topic base, but we're looking to see that the links are being addressed, because a joined up approach is, of course, vital to the whole success of the development plan process. Information on health has been a particular, I say, weaker point, and to a lesser extent, education and transport. But I think health is a bit of a newer issue for planning, and the engagement that's been set up, for instance, with education, the Council's Education Authority and Transport Scotland, etc., is perhaps not as well established in terms of health boards as it might otherwise be. Setting the evidence and the planning authority's view of the evidence in the context of past experience. I mean, it's not a blank sheet, and we're expecting people to reflect on the success of their existing strategy. And for housing, that's particularly important, because a lot of the land to meet the new housing land requirement is already in the pipeline. It won't be new. So we're not always getting where the development strategy of the existing plan has been, and we'd expect to see that. Clarity and transparency, it might be clear to the person that wrote it, but is it really clear to the reader, the uninformed or even slightly informed reader? And does it make the links that I talked about, and is it clear about any next steps? These are the things that it's just that kind of qualitative issue, and making sure that all the links and the different pieces of the jigsaw are in place so that you've got the firm basis to move on to prepare your local development plan. And it's that sort of, they've been very good at gathering the evidence, but perhaps not interpreting it, distilling it, and telling us what it means for the plan.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, a number that you touched on housing, we've got the housing emergency, and a number have been sent back because the local housing land requirement's not being justified. Somebody put to me recently, well, what's the problem if the local housing land requirement is high, lots of land is allocated. You mentioned that you use the Matler as the starting point, but then they're encouraged to be ambitious and to exceed the Matler. So what are you looking for, I suppose, in terms of the justifying the local housing land requirement?
Yeah, I suppose it's important that the housing land requirement is using the Matler as a starting point, because that's where MPF 4 says you have to exceed the Matler. So and really reflects on the evidence that informed the Matler, and then updates that evidence. The factors that fed into the Matler, such as the housing land audit, other important documents locally, like the local housing strategy, the strategic housing investment plan, up-to-date housing need and demand assessment. That has been something that a number of authorities have relied on, and that can give a real kind of robust evidence base to your updated figure. There might be new household projections, there might be updated migration assumptions, or there might be economic development assumptions that you can clearly explain to justify an uplift to the housing land requirement. But we would hope that basically what we're looking for is, it's not very much looking at the clarity of the explanation and making sure that it can be easily understood and that it's transparent. Sorry, did I miss the part of the question? Did you ask about the question about what's the harm in it being much larger?
Well, yes, that's what somebody put to me. It's like, well, what's the problem if the local housing land requirement is very high? Why don't we just put it in, and the market will, dictate it?
Yeah, well, I think it's really about having that plan-based approach, and if we're going to have a plan-based approach, we want the local housing land requirement to be based on figure as a housing need figure, but also reality checks it so that there's confidence in that being a figure that can be delivered in terms of the infrastructure capacity of the area and all the other kind of links that are required in the context of good planning. And that's very much what the guidance stresses, and that's what we're looking for here. So, an unevidenced, unsupportable housing figure set at some high level is, I think, unlikely to be in anyone's interest in terms of providing a sound basis to plan going forward.
And it is that connection, isn't it? It's an infrastructure-led, approach. And obviously, Stephen Allison mentioned, some of the infrastructure, health, education, transport. as being areas that have been kind of fallen down. What's been lacking is interesting. I found that interesting because, of course, I deal with developer obligations, I deal with the Section 75 agreements. So we're having discussions about these, kind of all the time. But equally, I can also understand that it's difficult for somebody like Transport Scotland, if they don't know where the sites are going to be able to comment on the infrastructure. So, what are the issues around there?
Yes, I think that's a key point about how authorities need to think about how they're going to use this evidence going forward, potentially to support developer contribution policies, if that's the road they want to go down. And if it is, then, it may not be, it's a case of horses for courses, that the level of detail one might expect in one area might be different in another area if the council is going to look for in the future to seek developer contributions in that area. The Act itself requires evidence reports to include, I think, the authority's views on infrastructure. It mentions matters including education capacity and transport and communications and drainage and water and energy supply and healthcare. And I think all authorities have picked up on that to a greater or a lesser extent. NPF 4 emphasises infrastructure first. So again, that's a further prompt to authorities to consider this matter carefully. Some authorities have undertaken structured audits of looking across all the different types of infrastructure to establish a baseline. That's worked well. But whatever, it's important the evidence report sets out a clear understanding of what the existing provision is, what the capacity is, and what if there's future investment that is in the pipeline, where that's coming forward. And there is, I think, as Alison's hinted at, there's that tie-in with the housing side of things. That infrastructure and housing are obviously going to be linked, where the areas where there's capacity may be that be one of the factors that feeds into the spatial strategy of the plan, and developer contributions. So these are all things the authority needs to think about and to be clear about in the evidence report. But I mean, the authority is only one player here, and they're not the infrastructure provider in all cases. So, again, I mean, Alison's mentioned health, but the whole process does require or rely on the level of engagement and involvement of the infrastructure providers as well. And they need to be willing to come forward and provide the evidence and engage with the council and find out what sort of information councils or planning authorities require. Because I think in some cases, like health boards, for instance, may not be themselves very familiar with working in a planning environment and may need some support to know what sort of evidence they need to go away and collate. So yeah, that dialogue needs to happen. And I think where there is evidence that authorities have been talking to their colleagues and talking to the key agencies, for a long time and in some depth in the run-up to the evidence report, that's where things have worked the best.
I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to jump to the end of the process now. And obviously, as you mentioned, Alison, before, you've got two options. You've got the letter that says it's sufficient, and then you've got the the assessment report that sets out all the reasons why it's insufficient. You mentioned that's why it comes across as being quite negative, because actually that's the kind of focus. But then, so the letter, the assessment report goes out and it says it's insufficient. Is there an opportunity for the authority to discuss that with the reporter? Do they have to go back to the beginning? Can they resubmit the same evidence for parts of it, but they only need to deal with the bit that wasn't good enough, if you like, it wasn't sufficient enough? And also, and I'm conscious, Stephen, I'm going to ask you this, but these are lots of questions. What about the passage of time? Because if I got all that evidence, and then I put it into the reporters, it then gets assessed, things have moved on. So yeah, lots of questions in there, but this is at the kind of end of the process. What happens after the report goes out?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's two scenarios. In the cases where we have the past letter, then we have also set out a list of advisories to authorities, and I don't think in any cases authorities have sought any clarification from us on those, but we certainly encourage authorities who are currently in the process of preparing evidence reports to look at those, because hopefully there's useful information in there and useful pointers. And though we may be pointing out matters that weren't quite as we would have liked to see in the context of overall sufficiency, in that case, it might be possible that a whole basket of these, if you like, more minor problems, if there were a lot of them, that might amount to something that would amount to an insufficiency. On the other hand, where the report's been returned, and we've obviously set out our more detailed reasons for why we've returned it, then authorities have tended to come back for a meeting with us, and we've been willing to accommodate that, not with the reporter who's done the gate check, but with a different reporter.
Okay.
To maintain an element of distance there.
Yes.
No, I think we're generally not expecting authorities to throw it in the bin and start again. It's definitely a question of going through our concerns and addressing those. Hopefully, we'd hope it would be a quick process. In the case of Glasgow, I think it was around 5 months, which seems reasonable. There will be that is a time lag, and a longer time lag from when the evidence report was originally written as well, of course, because there's a time when we've been dealing with it. And certainly if there is any updated evidence, then certainly that's an opportunity to bring the evidence report up to date, and that should be taken. Because yes, it's in everyone's interests for the evidence report that's going forward to support the plan to be as up to date as possible.
That's useful. Obviously, you mentioned there that if there's the chat afterwards, it's with a different reporter. Alison, I was going to ask you, for the reports that come back in, the ones that failed at the first hurdle, and they come back in and then have to be assessed again, does that go to the same reporter or a different reporter who might have a different view on sufficiency?
Yeah, we at the moment we're endeavouring to appoint the same reporter. Now, we can't promise that we'll always be able to do that, but that's what we're trying to do, just because it seems more efficient.
Yeah, no, it does. And I say I'm conscious of time, Victoria, and you're chilling me along. So my final question, which I'll be glad to know, and it's from the landowners and the kind of developers' point of view. So if the evidence report is found to be sufficient and the authority can proceed to the LDP, does that mean that the issues set out in the evidence report are not revisited at the examination stage, and it's therefore not worth submitting objections on points? Or because you were looking just at evidence and not the merits, these are points that can still be covered in objections? So, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, the LDP guidance is pretty clear that evidence that's found to be sufficient is not expected to be revisited at the examination. So I think the expectation of ministers and of the new planning system was clearly to take some of the heat and uncertainty out of the LDP examination stage. The intention is for the authority and stakeholders to walk hand in hand into the plan making stage with the same base common understanding of what the environmental conditions of the plan area are, what the infrastructure capacity is, and so on. But then it's what the authority does with that evidence, and the conclusions they draw from it, or the action they might take. Those are the things that are clearly up for debate, potentially in the examination. But we'd expect the focus of plan making to be on, and of our examination in due course to be on that side of things, the application of the evidence to things like site selection and placemaking. But there are a couple of caveats, and that is that you've mentioned the time lag, so new evidence may come along, and that's clearly something that might have a bearing and could be relevant. The scope of the examination formally hasn't changed, in that reporters are still required to consider any unresolved representation. So we still have to look at representations on any matter. And I think it probably is fair to say that housing is in some ways a special case, because the local housing land requirement is perhaps the one area where authorities are being asked to take something of a quasi-policy position at the evidence report stage.
Yep.
And as I think Alison's already touched on, we at the gate check stage as reporters, we're not taking a view as to whether the local house and land requirement is the best or ideal figure. We're just taking a view as to whether it's clearly and logically based on the available evidence.
Yeah. I think Victoria, we can probably have you back. We have Stephen and Alison back for a session on the first examination after the gate checks, just to see whether the examinations end up being quicker or whether we still get kind of bogged down. But I like that of walking hand in hand into the preparation. I did like that. So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think thank you, Alison and Stephen, for your contribution this afternoon. I think it's safe to say you've given us all a real insight into all the consideration and evaluation that goes on behind that letter that is then the end product, confirming either sufficiency or insufficiency in order to be able to continue to the next stage of the plan making process. So thank you very much for your time and your insights this afternoon. All that leaves me to do is say thank you to our audience for attending this afternoon. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good afternoon. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.